Well, esteemed ecumenical colleagues and friends, those who are located at different parts of Asia and also at different time zones, I welcome and greet you on behalf of the Christian Conference of Asia. It is, in fact, a great pleasure and privilege for me to greet you all on behalf of CCA and welcome to this online consultation, which is being organized and facilitated by the Christian Conference of Asia. During the past 5 years, the CCA has been giving special attention to the issues related to gender equality as well as advocacy on violence against women. And then during the past 5 years, CCA has organized several programs at the regional level and sub-regional levels, and also at the national levels in different countries as part of CCA's special efforts and focus on empowering women in church and society. Ever since we started experiencing the lockdown situation in almost all our countries in Asia, CCA has been focusing some of these pertinent issues that are related to the life of the people and how this pandemic has been affecting them. And CCA especially organized 3 programs virtually highlighting issues related to transformational leadership of women, then how religious extremism affecting women from minority situations or people, those who are living in countries where minorities are affecting problems, and also violence issues related to violence against women during this pandemic. So now that the focus of this particular consultation is on ensure gender equality, empower women, and lift up humanity. This is the focus of this consultation. And this particular theme will be reflected upon within the overall broader context and broader framework of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. As we know that out of the 17 SDGs and 17 goals, the goal number 5 is especially focusing on gender equality. So here, the world community is united together to affirm the fact that ending all forms of discrimination against women and girls, actually, it is not only considered as only as a human rights issue, but it also has a multiple effects. In that way, it is it will be a multiplier across all other aspects related to developments in all developmental issues in these worlds, what we have been focusing or we are supposed to focus in our situations. So it is in this context that this consultation that we are going to address some of these issues related to the gender equality. We know that several efforts have been made by the United Nations and other related agencies of UN and other multilateral organizations, as well as civil society organizations, including faith-based organizations, addressing the concerns related to gender equality over the years. And more specifically, starting from the year 2000 onwards, the United Nations Development Program together with the other UN partners, also has been addressing these issues. And one thing has been evident during the past 20 years or more, that some of those efforts have made significant advancements, ensuring the gender equality. And the world has seen some of the remarkable successes related to this particular area of work. And some of the statistics in the world shows that more girls are now in schools compared to 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And more regions have now reached gender parity, especially in primary education. And then women now make up actually 41% of the paid workers in the world. That is actually a remarkable achievement, that 41% the progress has been made. And this is outside of the agriculture related job. And this was actually only, if we take the example in 1990, this particular area where this was evident only 35%. So it is in this context that the Sustainable Development Goals now aim to build on some of these achievements, mainly to ensure that there is an end to discrimination against women and girls everywhere, not only in the developed countries or advanced countries in the world, but everywhere in the world that should be followed. So there are still gross inequalities that we have been observing, and especially in the areas in access to paid employments in several regions, and also the significant gaps that we observe that between men and women in the labor sectors or in the labor markets. Then sexual violence and exploitation. Then we all know that the unequal division of unpaid care, and also in the area of domestic work, and also discrimination in public decision making. All of these, or all these, remain as huge barriers in terms of making advancements in gender equality. So overall, one thing we can very clearly state, that gender equality is a fundamental human right that is an imperative for strengthening and empowering women and lifting up humanity for a just as a peaceful world, which all of us are longing, and all of us will cherish the value of such kind of a situation. We know that 5 years have passed now that the SDG goals, this has been ensured or envisioned. And also 25 years have passed now after the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And violence against women and girls, even after 5 years of these SDG goals, this has been envisioned. And 25 years after the Beijing Declaration has been pronounced and agreed, so still the situation is not improved. So violence against women and girls, that remains a pervasive human rights violation, and the situation still continues. In this context, that's ending all forms of discrimination against women and girls. This is actually to be considered and ensured as a basic human rights that needs to be protected. So the devastating impact of or impacts on women and girls, families and communities and societies everywhere are evident these days in most situations. And especially this is what we have been observing since the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and the uh, lockdown situation which we are all experiencing. So this situation now leading the world, especially the situation of women and children, mainly because of lack of adequate security for them and lack of health care as well as financial stability for them. So in all these areas and all these aspects, if we analyze, we can come to the conclusion that gender equality is absent. So this gender inequality prevails or persists in most of the areas in our day-to-day life. So in this context, that gender equality is the most emphasized value that is to be attributed to the 2030 agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Christian Conference of Asia firmly believes that full realization of women's rights and effective participation of women in decision-making process that should lead to inclusive and transformative policies that are really necessary for the achievements of the or attainment of the gender equality. So this consultation will specifically aim at deliberating on the importance of investing in concerns related to gender equality and promoting women's role to accelerate the effective implementation of the SDG goals. And we also try to contribute from our own situations and our own context and our own faith and values that we need to contribute to achieve the SDG 2030 agenda and its goals. So this is the reason that CCA has invited all of you, those who have expressed interest and those who have expressed a desire to be part of this process of CCA, mainly coming from CCA's member churches, member constituencies, and also CCA's networks, and also from other faith-based organizations. We invited you to be part of this exercise of CCA, which is going to focus on the gender equality within the overall framework of the SDG and the SDG goals. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, or thank you very much for expressing the interest, your special interest to be part of this consultation, with the hope that all of us will be able to contribute today and tomorrow when we discuss on a number of these issues. And I'm sure that this will be some way beneficial for most of you or all of you. And again, on behalf of my colleagues, those who are taking the initiative and leads in organizing this consultation, I welcome all of you, and also I express our profound gratitudes to each and every one of you for your willingness to be part of this consultation. So we look forward to your continued engagements in this particular area of CCA's work. The humble work which we are trying to do at this stage is mainly to uphold the values of promoting and protecting the rights and dignity of women, and especially in areas related to the work on ensuring gender equality and our efforts to empower not only women, men and women in society, in church and society, and sensitize them to be engaged in this noble effort of upholding the values of promoting gender equality in church and society. Thank you very much.
The topic we have for discussion in this session is Achieve Gender Equality, Empower Women to Lift Up Humanity. Now, I come from a different discipline, not theology, but law. And having said that, law has its own challenges in the way it has viewed this equation. And when I started preparing for this topic, I was trying to understand some of the components of this. When Dr. Matthews was speaking a little before I did, and he took us through so many different documents that are now available, which deal with standards relating to women's rights everywhere. He mentioned many of them, and I also went through many of them when I was preparing. And one unusual thing that I found is that even in the basic document, that is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the term empowerment is not used. In fact, the term power is not used at all. And that led me to think, what do we mean by power? And where does this word come from? And how is it relevant for today's session? Now, power from my discipline, that is from the discipline of law, has been dealt with by many jurists. And it comes from a Latin word, which you may be familiar with, you may have come across in your disciplines. But I will just put it on chat for your reference. It comes from a Latin word potere, which means to be able. And one jurist who dealt with this, which I thought I would share with you because it's fairly understandable, is a jurist called Hoffeld. And Hoffeld talked about different kinds of legal relations. He mentioned, for instance, the relation between right and duty that I have put down in chat, where he said he saw many of these legal relations as coming in pairs. So he said that when we talk about a right and duty, it means that if A has a right, then B has a duty. To give you a simple example, if we say that every child has a right to primary education, it means that the state has a duty to provide that primary education. So it comes in pairs. Saying that one has a right without saying, seeing where the duty lies will not really be a right. It is just, they're just words, and it does not really have a legal relationship. The other word that Hoffeld also discusses, among others, is power. And he looks at this legal relation as power and liability. So if X has the power to do something, then Y has the liability to face that power. So for instance, you go to a shop to buy a particular item, and all the items are labeled there with the price. You have the power to pick up any item and take it to the shopkeeper and say, sell it to me at this price stuck on it. As a consumer, as a customer, you have that power. And the shopkeeper has the liability to sell it to you at that price. He cannot then say that, no, I will not sell it to you at that price. So when we talk about power for women, that means that the liability should be there somewhere. Now, interestingly, in a lot of Latin phrases, and when we studied law, that's not true anymore, but when we studied law, we had to study a subject called Roman law. where we looked at where many of these words came from. And in Roman law, we see many words which use the phrase pa. For instance, we come across the term patria potestas, which refers to the pa that that the head of the family, that is the father, exerted against the wife and against children and others. So the patria potesta was a very important power which was held by men. Now, this is not a term that we find used in other cultures. We don't find the word patria potestas there. But we find that in reality, women in many parts of the world, and more particularly in Asia and Africa, often live with a patria potestas kind of power, where the male, as a head of the family or as a more powerful person, exerts power with regard to the wife, natural or adopted children, agnatic descendants, and anyone who marries and comes into that family. So when we look at the term power, we see that it had a lot of connotations which are fast changing. We also see that the topic that we have put up for today leads us to certain presumptions. I'm also going to add that in chat because this is something that we may take for granted, but it may not necessarily be true in every culture and in every context. Now, when we have a topic like the one that we are discussing today, achieve gender equality, empower women to lift up humanity, there are 4 presumptions that are raised. Now, the 4 presumptions which I have mentioned in chat so that I can go back and forward, and I hope the chat is visible to everyone, even though your connectivity may sometimes mean that you're not able to hear me, are important, I think, and should be the basis of a lot of discussion on empowerment of women. The first presumption that a topic like this raises is that women live in an unequal world, that we are not equal, that men are in a better position. And obviously, this better position happens because many societies in our world are patriarchal societies, which have traditionally and culturally preferred men over women and vested power in males rather than females in each society. So there is no doubt that though there might be some women who have attained the kind of equality that everyone aspires to, by and large, we are not talking about exceptions. By and large, women have not attained that level of equality that we would like them to have attained. The second is that women are disempowered, which means that, as we say that, people are born free, but everywhere you find them in chains. So on birth, everyone is born free, but over a period of time, a process called disempowerment happens. And this leads to, from a very young age, women becoming, or a girl child being more and more disempowered, whereas a boy child becomes more and more empowered. And when they reach this adulthood, the difference is very clearly seen that when men have more power, they are empowered, and something happens in society which leads to women being disempowered. And we all know that this happens because of patriarchal values from societies, presuming that women have certain roles to play, from societies naturally assuming that men are in charge of the family, and so on. We also see that this is not an irreversible process. We see that the third presumption that we have from our topic is that this is not a hopeless situation, that women can indeed be empowered, that they can, this balance can be shifted from a situation of disempowerment to a situation of empowerment. If that was not possible, it would be a useless exercise for all of us. And people like me who work with on human rights and gender, it would be extremely frustrating if this presumption were not true, that a process of empowerment is definitely needed. But as when I discussed the Hoffellian analysis, I stated that power also means liability. When women are empowered, there is a need for a sharing of that power. So power is a finite good. To ensure that everyone have the same kind of power, people with more power have to give up some power so that the disempowered can receive it. And finally, the presumption is that this empowerment can lead towards women's equality and can indeed lead to a better humanity for all. So when we look at these 4 presumptions that are there, and we try to examine it to see how does this process of empowerment come up, we do see that there has been a shift in the way that we think. Earlier, the language was not empowerment of women. The language would be women should fight for their rights. Now, it's just like telling a child who's being beaten up by his family, you should fight for your rights. Stand up to your parents and tell them not to beat you. We know that is not possible. We know that those who are historically vulnerable and historically disempowered, historically affected, cannot fight back. Or in other words, we must see that the protection of these groups or the empowerment of these groups is an external act. Or to reiterate, we cannot expect marginalized or oppressed groups to be resilient. There's a request on chat to share the PowerPoint. I just have some lecture notes. I'd be happy to share it with you or share it with CCA for distribution. So everything that I'm putting on chat, I already have, and I'm happy to share it. So what we need to keep in mind is that we cannot expect women to be resilient, to be able to fight back and to take power for themselves. There has to be some kind of an external act which actually leads to a situation where the balance of powers is achieved. Now, you may take the argument that, well, there are some groups where, this is possible, where people fight for their rights. And that is definitely correct. There might be some groups that are resilient. Many of our societies have emerged, the modern day societies have emerged from a process of fighting for freedom from colonial masters. And as a group, we may have been resilient, strong, coming together to fight. But we have to keep in mind the fact that, unlike an identity which might be there as a national identity, a woman identity is not, there is no pan-woman movement of taking power from men. So women tend to be situated in their communities, tend to be situated in their families, in their countries. And so having a movement where you wrest control is a little difficult. Of course, there might be women's lobbying. There might be cases where women's groups have lobbied for a better sharing of power, but it has not always been successful. So as those who are moving towards, having a better humanity for all, this burden of, or this task of empowerment, if I might say so, maybe through a legal process, which is through laws. So you make laws which give women better rights than men. And initially, everyone felt that, oh, this is the way to go. You have a law and automatically you will have better rights for women. But then the realization came in that having a law by itself is not all right. You may have a law which gives both men and women equal rights to get married, but that does not mean that women will automatically have a better right in family. We see, therefore, that both of them have a right to attend school, but girls and boys may not actually get the same level of education. So we saw that then it had to be fine-tuned with public policy, policies which gave incentives for girls getting educated, policies which increased the age of marriage in some countries, policies which had affirmative action for girls in positions of power, in legislative bodies, in decision-making bodies, in employments, and so on. Then we also see that social reform has also worked. So there have been reformers who have pushed to better power sharing, to equality for women, recognizing very well that women hold up half the sky, and without their equality, you cannot really expect improvement in human society as such. Now, when this external act has taken place and women have been empowered, where should the liability lie? Now, when we look traditionally at a model of human rights, we see that generally we talk about the citizen having power and the state having liability, or the other way around. But that equation is not enough for a gendered context, because women experience disability and disempowerment more often in their own families than they do outside. So while the state has that commitment, and there should be a liability on the state to make law and public policy in favor of women's empowerment, the liability for such empowerment also lies upon other bodies, rely on community organizations such as churches, rely on educational institutions such as schools and colleges, rely in healthcare institutions which often do not have women as a focus except when she is giving birth to a baby. It is definitely should be the focus of law, of public policy. It should also be the focus of family. So churches should, take the initiative, and things, religious bodies should take the initiative, and families must also take this initiative. So there is no question of empowerment of women or sharing of power without sharing the power that is currently concentrated in other hands. So in a family, it may be concentrated in the man. In a community, it may be concentrated in the way that power is held. I remember, one young, feeling as a young child in a church, that the pastor was a male, the choir, the invited speaker was a male. Any important person who held an office in that church other than the women's fellowship was a male. Only the choir had both men and women, but they tended to be heavily controlled by men. So these positive images of empowerment is lacking right from our families to the other community-based organizations that we have. And if women have power, all these organizations, all these institutions must have the liability to empower and to make sure that there is a sharing of power. Now, why is this important? We are trying to uplift humanity through a series of goals, which Dr. Matthews has already referred to, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see in SDGs goal number 5 is a very important goal, which, as I told you, the CEDAW and others don't really mention empowerment, but this goal does. And SDGs, when you look at the SDG goal 5, it talks about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Now, while this talks about gender equality, there can be a very good argument made, which is often made by a group of feminists called cultural feminists, that the way that men and women work and act, and that the way that they use power relationships is very different. So while one must not romanticize the women's role in caring, etc., or the fact that women are often peacemakers, it may be still something to ponder about, that empowering of women will lead to a cascading effect. When you have, because gender is one intersectionality, and there are several different intersectionalities. So when I talk about intersectionality, it is the different people or the different views or the different uh, points that one must keep in mind when one is discussing a particular goal or a particular idea. So it's not any longer appropriate, for instance, to talk about human rights without specifically discussing women, because we know that the dominant discourse has been a male discourse, and objective standards, as we say, have usually been defined in a male perspective. So when we bring in intersectionalities beginning with gender, we see that many other intersectionalities also tend to come in. I see on chat that there are, that children are a very important intersectionality. And we do see that empowering women has often meant that children in families also get empowered. And this has been seen, I can give you one example, where in a particular government policy, when they were allotting land to poor families, they decided to allot the land to the woman instead of the man, who was seen as a head of the family. And they saw a difference in communities where men had got that land. They soon lost it, they gambled it, they drank it. Some of them, of course, kept it and took care of the family. Where women had been given that land, they used it in very different ways, and they made sure that children were well taken care of, and that continuous access to food was possible from that grant of land. So I'm not saying that all men and all women think similarly, but empowering women has led to a cascading effect, which has improved the quality of life of other intersectionalities, whether one is talking about children or persons with disabilities, or on the grounds of race and so on. It is, the suffragette movement, for instance, women fighting for the equal right to vote, strongly supported the right of African American men to also have the right to vote. So this is something which is a useful thing to keep in mind, that empowering women across the board has seen very interesting and very valuable cascading effects for other marginalized groups in communities. Finally, I would like to leave you with two thoughts. One is, of course, one of my favorite articles from the Convention on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which talks about the duty of the state to take all kinds of measures to achieve the elimination of prejudices and customary and other practices which are based upon the inferiority of women. And this, I think, would lead to a better ground for empowerment, for a true empowerment process to begin. And without empowerment, women cannot be resilient, and women are not able to be truth sayers. So they're not able to, frankly, voice their opinion, push the agenda for other women, and to help out in general. So in order to, as the famous saying goes, one must speak truth to power, so that truth will become more powerful and power will become more truthful. And I think for this, we do need to empower women. I leave you with one quote that is one of my favorites, That is, these days, a sling of truth still can make Goliath fall. I firmly believe that empowering women will better the position of humanity and help the structures of patriarchy to fall. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarasu, for your enlightening and profound inputs on the given topic, your amazing clarification of our move forward, achieving and promoting gender equality through women's empowerment. Now I'd like to open the floor to the participants. Please, friends, raise your questions and make comments. Let me read two questions from the chat box. Yes. In a church where women are denied opportunity, what can we do? It's not that the church doesn't know what should be done. It's because men are willing to share the responsibility and give women the opportunity, less opportunity. So what can be the better way to achieve the sharing power and open opportunity for men and women? And also these can be the comments that we need to reread the scripture, Bible scripture, and from the feminist perspective to reinterpret the Bible and the gospel towards harmonious life of men and women in partnership. Anyone who wants to raise the question directly to Dr. Sarasu? Oh, yes.
Yeah, just to please feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or put the question in chat. I mean, I completely agree. And from the two chats that you read out, Grace, one is a question, one gives part of an answer on how, on some of the ways in which churches could create more equal situations for women. But as I said, empowerment cannot happen without power sharing. And it very rarely happens when one is powerless. So without the church taking a responsibility, that is not going to happen. So when you look at a lot lately in Western countries or in other places where the church is seen as a patriarchal body, they simply stop going to church, because what they see in church and what they see in the outside world are completely different. And they feel that, it goes against their interests as independent, free-thinking women to go to enter a place where they're not seeing other women and they're not hearing other women. And so one way that we might lose young women is if, we don't make that space for them. Because there is, earlier churches were seen as more progressive, but now we see that law and public policy are making fast strides. They are making there are a lot of laws and public policy which have empowered women. When they see that happening outside and they don't see it happening in families and in community organizations like churches, they will start moving away from them, or at least some of them may start moving away. And I believe that, as I'm not a theologian, but I believe that every community under the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, including churches, have a responsibility to ensure that women are empowered.
Is Dr.
Yeah,
go ahead. Yes.
That's it. If there are any more questions, I'd be happy to. Yes, letting go of power is always difficult, and which is why patriarchy has tends to self-perpetuate itself. So when something works for a powerful group of people, they are not willing to let it go. So whether we are talking about patriarchy, or we are talking about let us say religious fundamentalism, which rears its head in many parts of Asia, or we are talking about parental authority over children, or we are talking about caste, or race. These are all the differences people would like to continue because it privileges them. And it is not going to be an easy process, but we need to change before the law forces us to change. I don't think there should be an option in it. Churches should make this possible. They should have compulsory rules dealing with representation of women at every level of churches and in decision making. I always say that they have, if a church has no difficulty in involving women in fundraising, in taking a woman's tithe or asking her to contribute to the church financially, then she should also have a role in the decision-making process. It may start with small steps, but I hope it will increase over time.
Yes. Dr. Sarah, so you highlighted and emphasized the importance of awareness, education on gender equality, and also the social reform through the structural, systematic change and reformation. And in your secular work, how does it work? How do you cultivate the way forward? Because in the church, it's really a big Goliath we are fighting, or we are struggling to have a power sharing and also
Yes.
the equal opportunity.
I agree. And Dr. Matthews, for instance, mentioned violence against women. And it doesn't matter which society we live in, we still see violence against women. The ways that this violence may happen may be different, as one feminist put it, we shoot our women, you burn your women, but, we kill our wives and women nevertheless. And Francisco in chat has seen, how do you see culture as a hindering factor in women empowerment? If I were to point out one factor, which is the most important factor, it is culture. Because we breathe and live culture from the very day that we are born. And very often culture can be extremely disempowering because they disentitle women in many ways. It can be very, very simple in the ways that they see a woman's role. It can be in the way that it talks about the man being the head of the family, in the way that, we are more strict with our sons and are more apt to forgive their misbehavior than their daughters. So if a boy does something, it is, oh, he's a naughty boy. If a girl does something, we tell her, no, you shouldn't be like that. What do people say? It is a reputation of the family, and so on. So culture is definitely one of the biggest stumbling blocks. But as the CEDAW says, we have to take steps to change that culture. And it will begin by involving more women, have equal numbers of men and women delivering the message in church would be one way to go. Have equal representation for women in all lay committees would be one way to go. Make sure that in the in youth group, when study aids are being created, that they are being done in a way that is gender sensitive and not pushing women to do certain particular roles. I remember I had visited, a court in England where, 3 or 4 of the judges were hosting us. And one of the judges, who was a man, was pouring tea for everyone, all of us. And I said, that's unthinkable in India. Either they would call someone else to come and pour the tea, or one of the women would pour it. And he said, he laughed and he turned to me and said, oh, here we men know our place, very jokingly. And I thought that was, so nice that he said that. But it is a conscious effort. It does not come easily. For many of us, when we faced the other as we grew up, maybe someone who was not like us, a different religious group maybe, or a transgender maybe, we had to fight against our learned prejudices and our stereotypes. And that is something that we individually must do. But without community support, without church support, this would not be an easy thing at all. I see that there is a hand raised.
Yes, Oinike. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your sharing, Dr. Surasu, especially on the gender equality and the importance of law. In Indonesia, currently we are still struggling with elimination of sexual violence bill, and we are waiting. We hope that this year it will be approved. And I have one concern to ask about your opinion on how women empowered during this pandemic. Women as housewives deal with the double or multiple burden at home and in this pandemic because they have to do the domestic house, deal with their own works, and also be teachers at home for their children, accompany them to study virtually, and many more. Do you have any experience in India related the bill or any law that made by your government which deal with the gender equality in this pandemic situation? Thank you.
Yes. The pandemic situation is, and I think Dr. Matthews briefly referred to it in his talk as well. In India, like I suspect many parts of the world, we have seen that when there is a disaster of any kind, that those who are disempowered become further disempowered because they are already vulnerable. And this is something that we see in India. And I'm sure it is true of other parts of the world as well. That, you know, how do I put it? That, you know, the normal support mechanisms which were available at the time of non-pandemic times have also broken down, which means that whatever was existing, like, you know, in a lockdown situation, for instance, where a woman could normally go and get help from a particular from a police station or somewhere else. During the lockdown, she is unable to do so. And this has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of women. And also because of the lockdown, she's stuck at home with her abuser. He's not going out to work, and she can't go to her family or friends for help. Something else that we have seen in India is that child marriages of girls has actually increased during the pandemic for two reasons. One is because schools are shut, and where girls used to go to school, they are just at home. Secondly, because families have faced wage and job losses, they are worried about being able to get money to marry off their girls. So sometimes they marry off their daughters, getting some money from the boy or paying a very minimal dowry. So the pandemic has actually increased many forms of violence against women and children. I'm just leaving something in chat for you where we did have a book launch, and the book is available on the link if you go to it. It's called The Gendered Contagion: Perspectives on Domestic Violence During COVID-19. It's a book that I've edited, and we worked with some organizations to do it. We have a few pieces from some parts of Asia, and it might give you a good idea of how the pandemic has actually increased domestic violence for many groups of women in Asia, if you need more information.
There's one question from Yang Mei from Hong Kong that's about the change of mindset for the women who are in the leadership. You know, their mindset is much occupied with the patriarchal concept. So how can we change it?
Yes.
That's the question.
Yeah, there are no easy answers to that. You know, patriarchy is not a man-woman question. It's a question of men and women against patriarchy. And women can be as patriarchal, but it is very rare, first of all, for a woman to reach that situation, that position. And many senior women, reach that position only if they play ball with everyone else, only if they are ready to be co-opted into that patriarchal system, which is very sad. Otherwise, there seems to be a glass ceiling in many areas for women who think differently or have a feminist take on things. So you definitely need to ensure that that happens. But the more women you have it, the more diverse views you have, and then finally you may have women who have strong feminist stance as well. Someone has also said, how can you convince the young generation to help bring gender equality? Yeah, I think that'll happen only if one, the younger generation is sensitized and brought up in a non-patriarchal mode. Otherwise, when they grow up, they have to live with patriarchal institutions, so they will continue to remain like that. And and we can't wait for them to grow up. The time is, we have to change things now. So we have to begin making the change now.
I would like to ask a recent question. What is the reason that certain policies often discriminate against women to get their rights in society? So, in this reality, what is the reason in the part of the law that discrimination against to women is still the exist, and you can see what you explained to us this afternoon in the laws overview or laws aspect. What is the reason why this discriminating against women still exists? Thank you, Doctor.
All right. Thank you. If I've understood you rightly, Juliana, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Juliana, you had asked why laws still continue to discriminate against women. What is the cause for that? Again, there are no easy answers for that. And the problem is that when we look at how laws are made, each country has its own way of making laws. And when we talk about laws in general, we some writers tend to put them as lead laws and lag laws. It's a very rule of thumb kind of difference, that very often when we look at laws, the law is only running to address a problem. Like now we have a pandemic, so then you will make laws that you have to wear a mask, this is how you apply for a vaccination and so on. So those are all lag laws. The law is running to catch up with societal changes. Very rarely you can also have lead laws, that laws are trying to push society into some kind of change. And of course, because of deeply entrenched cultural values like patriarchy, for instance, lead laws are very difficult to make. One is you have to get enough of a majority to pass it through the legislature in any country. And if they are going to be laws that are fairly controversial, especially from religious groups in the country, then there is a risk that such laws may not be passed. So for instance, it is much easier practically to pass a law which says that every building must have a lift or an elevator so that a person with disability can go up. But it's much more difficult for a law to say that every housewife should get half the property of her husband or half the salary of her husband. You get my point? So some laws are easier to make than other laws. And unfortunately, a lot of laws dealing with the empowerment of women are laws which fall into this category, that they are laws which challenge deeply held cultural values. And so it is very difficult to challenge, to bring about any changes to these laws. I'm not saying we should not, we should, but it may be sometimes practically difficult for political parties to bring about the changes in these laws. There may also be parties, of course, who don't want to change, who want to go in the opposite direction, who want to keep women at a subordinate, a lower level. And unfortunately, we have that kind of, those kind of political parties also in our world today.
I am given the topic of SDGs and eliminating violence against women. But I also need to recognize that the achievement of the SDGs is currently being challenged by the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, which we did not envisage at all when we started with SDGs. So this is a huge challenge that we also need to address as we are trying to achieve SDGs. And there is also a concern that not only we are facing a challenge of progressing in achievement of the SDGs, we're actually experiencing setbacks. So the gains that we have made before the COVID crisis are being eroded by the pandemic. And so we also need to recognize that. So if you can click on the slide, please, just will show the title and my name. And so I will, I should like to begin just briefly touching upon what COVID-19 crisis is impacting on gender equality in the world and in Asia and Pacific. And I also note that this was there was a lot of interest on this issue during a presentation in the first half. So I hope that this will remind you of the challenges that the COVID-19 crisis is imposing upon us, particularly us who are working on promoting gender equality and SDG 5, which is the goal, as Ronald mentioned, focusing on gender equality within SDGs. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 crisis, as everybody knows, it is a health crisis. But it's not only a health crisis, it is also a care crisis, and it's an economic crisis, and it also has a shadow pandemic. And I will explain why we have a shadow pandemic, but let me first talk about the care crisis. Next slide, please. What the pandemic has really exposed is the extent to which our societies have been depending on women's unpaid and underpaid care work. Over 70% of unpaid work in the world has been carried out by women, and over 70% of healthline frontline workers are women, and those people are underpaid. So if there weren't this a contribution of underpaid and unpaid care work, we would have been faring much worse in this pandemic. Even before the pandemic, on a normal day in Asia and the Pacific, women spend 4.1 times more than men on care work at home. And in some countries in this region, women were spending 11 times more than men. Now, for example, as a result of the pandemic, in Bangladesh, 50% of women reported an increase in their unpaid domestic work responsibility, while only 44% of men reported an increase in their role in unpaid care work. Before the pandemic, men and women were involved in unpaid care work, but women were doing much more. As a result of the pandemic and the result of the measures introduced to prevent the spread of the virus, women's unpaid care work responsibility increased tremendously, but men's share has also increased. But proportionally, women were doing more, women's increase is much more than the increase for men. Now in Southeast Asia, so this is now for the health sector, underpaid health sector care work, 79% of nurses are women, And in Western Pacific, 81% of nurses are women. Now, emerging reports in the Philippines indicate women healthcare workers, who are make up the 75% of the health workers in the Philippines, are experiencing increased discrimination during COVID-19 and are being refused access to basic service and transportation. So obviously, healthline workers generally are facing some level of discrimination because of the perception that they were so close to the virus. But women are more dominating the health sector, particularly at the frontline workers level. So it's natural that more women suffer discrimination than men. And in Indonesia, a report also indicated that women working in health sector were recommended by their family members to stop working because of the stigma attached to her profession, and how that stigma influenced the rest of the family. So they were recommended by family members not to work as care workers in health sector anymore. Now, there are many reasons for women and men to stop working in as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, but this is one of them. Now, while we are very much aware of this acute increase in women's unpaid care work responsibility as a result of various COVID-19 response measures, we note also that women and care work remain glaringly absent from the stimulus packages and emergency measures. So many countries have are providing stimulus packages and emergency measures, but they are not really taking care of the fact that women are disproportionately shouldering unpaid care work, which may mean that even if they are given stimulus packages to boost their economic activities, they won't have time to make use of that support. And those issues are not incorporated in much of the stimulus packages and emergency measures provided by countries in this region. Next slide, please. And of course, it makes us realize that the COVID-19 crisis is an economic crisis. And again, we also need to revisit the data from the pre-COVID time. So pre-pandemic, gender gaps persisted in labor force participation, gender segregation of the labor market, financial inclusion, and representation in senior management positions across the business sector. Without COVID-19, women were already disadvantaged and excluded in the economy. They were occupying precarious jobs, mostly, particularly in Asia Pacific. The majority of the women working can be found in the informal sector. There are certain professions where we hardly see any women, and there are other professions where we see predominantly female employees. And we also need to be aware of how the salary or pay structure may look like in different sectors. In a study in Indonesia, in the waste management sector, we found that in the waste management plants, so where waste is segregated and also prepared for next steps of waste management, men are paid bi-weekly, so they get 2 weeks salary. It's much more secure. Women get paid daily, so if they don't show up, they don't get paid. There's very little benefit given to that kind of pay structure. Also, women were assigned to lower paid tasks. So only men are allowed to operate machines to, squash the plastic bottles and things like that. But things that can be done by hand, those tasks are given to women. So they get paid less and they get paid precariously, increasing their vulnerability against any shocks. So of course, women were hit harder by the economic crisis aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic. So already before the COVID-19, female participation in the labor force ranged from 60.1% in East Asia, that's the top end of the spectrum in the region, to only 25% at the bottom end in South Asia. And South Asia is the only a region in the world today, or even before the pandemic, that we saw a decrease in women's labor force participation. And also around 75% or more of the workers in the garment, textile, and food production were women in Cambodia, Lao PD, People's Democratic Republic, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. And these sectors are set with very low wages to remain competitive in the international trade market. And that's where we find women working. So that's another data to show how women are concentrated in more precarious job sectors. And this was before the COVID. And we also know that those sectors were hit harder by the COVID-19 crisis. So many textile factories, for example, had to be closed down because the sale had decreased. And that's the sort of sector. It's just a bad chain reaction. Women are already in a very low-paid sector and precarious because now they are not able to sustain themselves. And then it's more women than men who are losing jobs because of that. Now, again, the responses by government to the economic crisis aspect of the COVID-19 crisis are not taking into consideration these gendered differences in the labor market. So we need to be aware that one size fits all kind of support packages are not necessarily helping everyone. And we also need to take into account the particularly vulnerable situations of certain groups of women because they need extra boost, and that's often missing in many of the response measures. Next slide, please. So now the shadow pandemic, and this was raised by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who alerted the world by saying, peace is not just absence of war. Many women under lockdown for COVID-19 face violence where they should be safest in their own homes. This issue of safety or lack of safety rather in their own homes during the lockdown was raised by the previous speaker. And what the Secretary General did was that he related this to a war. Violence against women is like a war situation. Women are victims of war in this case, right? Already before the pandemic started, as many as 2 out of 3 women in some countries in Asia Pacific region reported experiencing violence. And less than 4 in 10 women experiencing such violence actually reported these crimes, or even before reporting, they didn't even seek help of any sort. So violence against women is a very silent war where victims suffer in silence without acknowledgement of the wider society of their suffering. So what happened? Measures to contain the spread of the virus, such as lockdown and stay-home measures, have made women with violent partners increasingly find themselves isolated from the people and resources that can help them. They are no longer able to go out and seek support or refuge, they are no longer able to report to the police station of the cases of violence. And they no longer take their children out of the home to go to a shelter. They have to stay living with the abusers. And the cases increased. However, the reporting channels were also shut down. Many service providers to victims and survivors of violence against women use smartphone apps in many big cities in this region. But when you are living in the house 24 hours being together with abusers, they can actually monitor how their victims are using their smartphone. They can even install an app to track the usage of the smartphone of their victims. So even smartphone apps is not safe. And if you are stuck in the house in the same house, you can't even make a phone call asking for help because someone may be listening to your conversation. So during the already people are not reporting or seeking help. The COVID-19 measures made it even more difficult for survivors and victims to report or seek support. And also, if you remember during the lockdown time, some of the services, including health services, remained essential, being allowed to operate. Unfortunately, support to domestic violence survivors, for example, was not necessarily considered essential. So essential service providers were allowed to move around the towns, reaching out to the people in need. If the services for the victims of domestic violence are not recognized as essential, then they are not allowed to move around the town and reaching out the people who need them. So recognizing this kind of service as essential is really important. And even if it's just described as women's health services, it would have been helpful, because often it's the health service providers who first detect the cases of domestic violence. So if victims, or we call them survivors too, if they can reach out to health service providers, it could be a start of seeking help. However, during the COVID-19, particularly when it was very hard, health services were restricted. I mean, they're prioritizing COVID-19 related services, and women's health services was not necessarily a priority. So it was also reduced in scale. Also during the lockdown, new or emerging forms of violence against women in cyberspace has been acknowledged. So for example, we were using a lot of Zoom meetings, and sexual harassment can also happen in those settings. And this was not really well noticed previously because people are not so abundantly using Zoom calls. So there are many new ways of violence against women that we now need to address. And one good thing is, if we can call it that way, is that this issue has become attention of the media. Of course, the Secretary General making such a powerful statement helped, but many international and national media outlets talked about how domestic violence increased under the lockdown. And some countries actually increased investment in support to be provided to those victims. So for example, they increased the number of people operating as, you know, if the mobility is possible, then operating to go around checking on previous victims, because they had been supported by those service providers before the pandemic, so they can go and visit them again to make sure that pandemic did not resurface that violence again. But it's not easy. Even hotlines couldn't really operate because of the fear of being listened to, the conversation, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. There are different types of responses provided by different governments, and UNDP, together with another UN agency, UN Women, we are carrying out an assessment of different COVID-19 responses from gender equality perspectives. We are trying to see what kind of gender sensitive measures are being provided in different countries. And this is why I was able to tell you that many stimulus packages, for example, were missing out on unpaid care work element, or they were not taking into consideration the particularly vulnerable status of women workers. But the majority of measures globally are focusing on addressing gender-based violence. And this also relates to the fact that the more attention has been given to this topic. So some of the examples that I wanted to highlight today include different types of outreach and information sharing on domestic violence risks, contract details and means to obtain support, etc. So some private sector companies even shared, as they were releasing their employees to go home and work from home, they gave them a package of information and resources to know what they can do if they are ever subjected to domestic violence. There are some hospitals where they screen people for COVID-19. They kind of included the question about domestic violence or possibility of domestic violence. So it's a little more private conversation with a nurse, and women and women with children may be able to share that information away from their spouses. Also, in some quarantine facilities, violence against women happened, so they started providing women only quarantine facilities, and then moved them to different shelters. Also, they had to develop, many countries had to develop a new code of conduct or standard operating procedures under COVID-19 measures circumstances. They couldn't use the same code of conduct or standard operating procedures because of the different measures. For example, this lockdown. So reporting steps, for example, had to be altered. And so many countries took that upon themselves to do that. Some countries also provided packages with expanded cash transfers to top up benefits for recipients of the maternal and child health cash transfers. So people who are already receiving, for example, maternal and child cash transfer or cash for care for child benefit kind of services received a top up, because governments are aware that they had now more role as caregivers. And some women actually had to stop working, even though the COVID-19 crisis still enabled them to continue working. They had to stop working because now they have more people at home demanding their care and attention. So then income was taken away from them. And this is why the top up was offered. And so the next one is also about helping parents with the child care responsibility, extra cash. And this is a case where child care providers can actually come to your house in a context where child care providers can come to your house, or you can take your children to child care facilities. For example, in Thailand, child care facilities facilities operated in some part of the crisis, but they had to take less number of children, and this also increased the cost of childcare. And also some countries and companies gave extra leave days to parents so that they can help with unpaid care work responsibilities. Now, why am I talking about these things when we're talking about violence against women? Because violence against women doesn't happen in vacuum. Where women are put in a position of less power in a relationship with men, violence against women will thrive. So we need to achieve gender equality if we really want to eradicate gender-based violence. And so whatever the measures that we might implement or support to promote gender equality and women's empowerment will have contributory factors towards eliminating violence against women. So, for example, the last example, the provision of additional 5 days of leave or reduced working hours to those who have family care responsibilities. Violence at home, particularly against women, increased during lockdown because of partly because of the sort of increased level of frustration, of lost income, anxiety, fear of unknown, and women and sometimes children who are considered the weaker and less powerful members of the household became the subject of violence by those who are in the opposite side. So releasing their attention is also a positive measure, and giving them like time off but paid, for example, the last example here, can also release that reduce that tension at home, and that can also lead to reduced violence at home. So next slide, please. And this is also relating to the analysis that broader gender equality can help eliminate gender-based violence, right? And COVID-19 really kind of dominating our lives at the moment, and we don't see sufficient amount of attention from the government to provide services to take care of these cases. But we also noted that the task forces, decision-making bodies that are designing and deciding on the types of measures and responses against COVID-19 pandemic are dominated by men. If we don't see women in decision-making bodies that are determining what kind of stimulus packages should be given, or what kind of services should remain essential, maybe the issues where more women are facing than men are not making into the decision-making table. So as you can see, as members of those task forces, women are missing, and as leadership of those task forces, women are missing. And I think this is something that we need to take into account when we talk about gender equality issues. Next slide, please. This is just to share some of the global pictures. So it's not just the Asia Pacific region. Around the world, COVID-19 responses are determined mostly by men. So next slide, please. Now we're gonna just come back to the SDG 5, right? And we all know that SDG 5 is not a separate goal from the rest of the SDGs. It has to be understood and addressed as an integral part of the entire SDGs as a package, because the impact of SDG 5 is cross-cutting. And within SDG 5, yes, we do have the particular target around the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls. But it is also a very critical element of a bigger picture. Right? So just like SDG 5 relates to the rest of the goals, this particular indicator also relates to the entire SDG 5. So we need to look at those linkages. If we don't look at the linkages and try to look at gender-based violence as a standalone subject, then we may not be able to remove the structural barriers that perpetuate gender-based violence. If 5 years from now, we don't want to talk about gender-based violence anymore, then we cannot just be addressing gender-based violence as a way of minimizing the risks. We need to remove the structural barriers. And this is what I wanted to conclude with of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mio, for the explanation about the SDGs and thank you for your sharing. Today, I will talk about how SDGs approach to the national level and also the non-government organizations in Korea. In fact, many organizations and strategies of the government in Korea are already operating along with SDGs. Civic groups and others are affected because government organizations have set SDGs as a significant goals and target to achieve in different sections and the work. The Korean government is making great effort to ensure that SDGs is continuously considered in the planning, enforcement, and evaluation stages in many sectors, not only in the government organizations, but also in different sectors. The first part of today's presentation was based on the report on the Korean Sustainable Development Goals, which I will introduce later, from the Ministry of the Environment Commission on Sustainable Development of Korea. How SDGs is applied in Korea can be seen in more detail through KSDGs, which means that Korean Sustainable Development Goals. In Korea, KSDGs was established to reflect more actively on SDGs in Korean society and set goals suitable for Korea. The new goals set the shared vision of humanity to be achieved by 2013 to raise the quality of life for the present and future generations within the frame of the sustainable development. Major countries such as Germany, Switzerland, and France have adopted SDGs as a national agenda and used them for policy formulation and evaluation for the sustainable development of their countries. In line with that, Korea have also seen the need to establish SDGs based on the interministerial consultation and public participation. And there was a need for developing and distributing sustainability indicators. Indicators should be developed and distributed, and sustainability assessment should be executed every 2 years to monitor the fulfillment of the indicators. So it is necessary to strengthen the status of related organizations and the legal framework so that the internal ministerial functions, such as the enhancement of sustainability in the economic and social dimension, can be carried out along the establishment of key SDGs. Yes, unlike the top-down approach, the establishment of key SDGs was performed in a bottom-up manner with the participation of relevant ministries, private working groups, stakeholders, and the general public. Finally, to follow up the implementation of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Committee was established in the domestic part, and the Open SDGs Forum in the international part is opened. In particular, the SDGs Forum was co-hosted and organized by civic society. The gender equality objectives discussed in SDGs are as followed. So it's the same: eradicating discrimination against women, eradicating violence of women, respect and value housework, ensure women's participation in social activities and equal opportunities, and ensure universal childbirth-related access to health and rights, expand access to core technology to strengthen women's empowerment. And there are also specific indicators and targets for the 2030 in Korea. So you can read the follows. Then how can this be achieved? That is the important question. How can civil society participate in achieving the goal other than setting this goal? What is related to this is Gender Equality Index and Gender Perspective Budget in Korea. This policy is legislated and applied to all public bodies. First, the Gender Equality Index is an indicator designed to realize real gender equality by systematically and comprehensively evaluating the impact of government policies on the gender and the causes of gender discrimination. All governmental organizations are required to access their work in accordance with this index at the stage of project planning, progress, and evaluation. The category is very specific. So you can read: strengthen gender stereotypes, femininity, masculinity, prejudged, revealed. So these are the categories that we can check every time when we plan for the project in the government organizations. And also the other, like civil society, civil organizations can also utilize this format to check their gender-based violence, whether they are having it or not. Second is Gender Perspective Budget. So it is a system that allows women and men to benefit equally from the budget by analyzing the impact of the budget on the women and men in advance and reflecting it in the budget compilation. The Gender Perspective Budget is operated especially by local government as well as the national government. Gender sensitivity budgets are sometimes used for the gender sensitivity education for the government officers and to strengthen citizens' capabilities in conjunction with the NGOs. This effort continues because of the deepening gender inequality in Korea. Globally, gender inequality has changed a lot since COVID-19. Over the past 2 decades, unpaid household work hours have declined for women and increased for men, but the situation remains unchanged, with the women spending more time than men. Moreover, it is predicted that women's unpaid housework will increase again due to the COVID-19, as Maya also mentioned. As women stayed at home after COVID-19, unpaid housework hours also increased, especially with closed and remote classes. The situations in which they had to take care of their children in their home increased because women were often the subject of the care for their children. In Korea, the number of female assembly members and female managers is about 2 to 3 out of 10. As of January 2020, only 19% of South Korean assembly members were women. South Korea ranked third among OECD countries in the lower order. Even though many efforts have been made to equal a number of members of the National Assembly, with the large number of female members elected through the 21st National Assembly elections held in April 2020, however, the percentage of female members were 28%. In Korean society, only 15% of all managerial positions are female. This phenomenon is more profound in middle and higher positions at work. COVID-19 has caused more women to leave work. Women who had to take care of their children had no choice to leave their work. Sexual violence is still on the rise. Online sexual violence increased significantly during COVID-19. Then so how do each NGOs perform its role to achieve SDGs in the face of this reality? The first is gender governance. Gender governance was first launched in 2013 as a way to implement gender mainstreaming by citizens, the final beneficiary of the policy, without reducing it to the internal process of the administration in the process of setting into the system. Gender governance is the conduct of the policy monitoring activities in conjunction with the local organizations and residential groups with gender sensitivity perspectives. Citizens and NGOs participate in this process and exert influence so that SDGs can be properly reflected in the operation of the agency. Various monitoring was conducted in various regions, and this is the part that Korea YWCA contributed the most in connection with SDGs. This structure allows citizens to present policy improvements directly from a gender sensitivity perspective on city and autonomous policies. This structure allows the citizens to prevent policy improvement directly from. Another advantage is that many women's organizations were organized in this process. Activists participated in these gender governance activities, developing local women's group and forming mutual network. The National YWCA of Korea is an organization established in 1922, and now it has 52 branches throughout Korea. One of the programs that comes to mind when someone in Korea think of YWCA of Korea is the monitoring project that I mentioned earlier. The monitoring program, this project is carried out using the Gender Equality Index that I showed. Head office of YWCA of Korea is conducted at the level of the government agencies, and each branch is working in conjunction with the local government in each region. This monitoring project aims to eliminate all gender discrimination in this society, and especially in the government level. In addition, YWCA of Korea operates counseling centers and shelters for the victims of violence against women and conducts campaigns to eliminating sexual violence in the society. As many of you know already, maybe here, the Thursdays in Black campaign is that YWCA of Korea is joining with the World YWCA. Now we are trying to make this campaign to be more localized by translating and promoting more diverse projects to make more members and to make more citizens to participate in this campaign, and also let them know how this is horrible, how it is horrible for the gender inequality in Korea. And we are also want to promote to let them know the importance of eliminating sexual violence in Korea. And we also had campaigns for the gender pay gap more than last 5 years. And finally, last year, the Day for Equal Pay established. Our efforts to achieve SDGs continue by informing citizens of equal rights and presenting unequal realities of women to the government regarding the pay gap. In order to provide jobs for women in the region, programs are also underway to strengthen women's work capabilities. YWCA provides education and also jobs for the career interrupted women. We also provide education for the teenagers and young people to make it narrow the gaps of knowledge between women and men in gender perspectives, and provides a platform for women, for young women leadership to be nurtured. In Korea, ecumenical organizations and Christian women's group are also joining to achieve SDGs. Recently, the National Council of Churches in Korea published a manual to prevent and overcome sexual violence in churches. It is for eradicating sexual violence in church and protecting victims. Also, women's groups have been united for the last 5 years, worshiping together against misogyny in Korean society and crimes against women. Our prayers were our movement. The worship service made people think of diversity and inclusivity and praying together for the victims of gender-based violence. I believe that we must do our best we can in our own areas to address gender equality. To this end, I am also trying to achieve SDGs at YWCA level and also in ecumenical level. And so are many ecumenical colleagues. The problem of gender equality is not something that I can solve alone or only between women. It can be solved when we make it our common goal, like SDGs. So there are our common goals, which is called SDGs. I want to emphasize that we are not alone. You are not alone, of course. And there are countless people in Asia and in the world struggling to solve this problem and in here today. I hope we can remember our goals together and move forward to solve the gender inequality through SDGs project. Thank you.
Regarding the question, there was a question regarding the availability of the report or the data against gender-based violence. If maybe Ms. Ko can tell us where we can access this and where we can get those information.
There has been a number of reports produced by different governments, NGOs, UN agencies on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls, or the impact of COVID-19 on gender equality. And for example, I mean, obviously, Korea has produced their own, which you just benefited from the presentation. Indonesia made one, Mongolia made one. So there are several countries issued those reports, and they are available in English. And also UN agencies such as UN Women produced a particular report focusing on the impact on gender equality in this region as well. So do please check those reports. UNDP and UN Women are issuing a new report. Actually, the launch will be today on the COVID-19 task forces. I took the data from that report, but official launch is this evening, morning time in New York, because it's a global report. I will share with you the publication on the COVID-19 task forces once it's launched tonight. It's actually a report with the data about gender equality in public administration. So it's a broader report, but it has a chapter on COVID-19 task forces.
Yeah, thank you. The other question is regarding what can faith community contribute towards ending this violence against women or addressing this, especially in terms of rescuing, in terms of helping them, and also how can we voice this out within the faith community, within our church community? What are the practical ways that we can do? I think one, what Hanbit had mentioned about the gender equality index is a good way of starting something like that, whether to check ourselves, whether we are gender sensitive, are we addressing this enough? But what are the are the practical ways that we can do? And also, if you may give us some suggestion on how this, the reporting, what are the alternative ways of reporting if the online, the phone calls and all the digitalization, if it can be tracked, what could be the other alternatives ways? Yeah, thank you. I'll address to Ko, and maybe Handit can add something later on.
Well, gender-based violence is a very, very sensitive topic, and it's very complex. So victims sometimes prefer not to talk to people around them because of the perception that this is a private matter, because this is a shameful matter that we should not talk beyond the doors and the walls of my house. But also at the same time, it's something that, so sometimes they prefer to talk to a third party. So the service providers who are not relating to their church, they're not relating to their families, may be a preferred option for them to go and talk to. At the same time, because it's a very sensitive issue, people don't want to talk about it with a stranger. So in UNDP's interventions around this area, like for example, we normally start with setting up a safe space where women can come and talk about their experiences without fear of being judged or being told, well, it's your fault. Right? Because that's also happened when women say that their husbands are not happy, they're beating them up. Sometimes the advice is like, well, you should do better. You should be pleasing your husband. You should be doing what, you're making sure the house is always clean, children are not crying, the food is nice and tasty. And that actually corners those women further, because then they don't know where to go, nobody understands me, that kind of situation. So first, it's to set up a safe space where women can come and without any fear of being judged, they can share. And you need to build that trust first. But I would imagine that in a community like a church community, that kind of sense of trust and safe, in the sense of safety, is already available, and you can set up a group where women feel they're not talking to complete strangers, they're talking to a safe group of people. But then now and then, do please bring in service providers to your conversation. So this is a third party, so you may feel more safe to talk about it. And actually, there's a very good example of a service provider in South Korea, started in Seoul. It's called the Sunflower Center. And it provides all different types of required services for victims of domestic violence in one place. Because what normally happens with victims of domestic violence, you may, finally you bring all your courage together and then go to a police station. And they say, well, go and get your medical certificate. You go there. And then you are like, but I can't go home because it's not safe there. So then they say, well, you go and find this NGO who can give you some safe home. So you start wandering around town looking for service providers for different needs. And you may even be dragging your small children with you because you couldn't leave them at home. It's called second victimization, right? So you're being victimized of violence, and then second victimization by public services. So the Sunflower Center model is that you go to one place and then you get all the support available in that. And also those places are accessible in hospital, which is the least conspicuous place for women to walk into, right? And then you say, well, actually I'm here because I've been beaten up. And then all the support will come to you. This model was also replicated in Jakarta city. And I have to say that the city of Jakarta did really well, that they kept it open during the COVID pandemic. When there's so much pressure on the health sector to release beds, release doctors, release nurses to attend to COVID cases, that domestic violence support center stayed open for domestic violence victims only. So it is possible. But this kind of a service is important, and maybe people can mobilize community engagement to open such space. So first, maybe safe space, and then bring in third party to raise awareness. And also not just, I mean, there are two different awarenesses that we need to look at. One is the awareness amongst women victims that actually this is not something that you should stay silent. You are actually entitled to raise this as an issue. And they think, oh no, this is my fault, I shouldn't be complaining about it. No, you know, you should be empowered enough to raise it. But then you need safe place to raise it. Another level of awareness is people around them. People surround them, like thinking, oh, you know, I hear voices coming from my next door. They're fighting, I hear things flying around, glass is broken, cry of a woman's voice, but it is another person's house, I'm not interfering. So they need awareness raised so these bystanders know what to do, what kind of actions they can take, what kind of places that they should go to get more support so they can do something about them.
Yes, yeah, that is really important. You mentioned about, you know, the one stop where you have everything, especially in terms of during this pandemic time when they can go to a hospital, and gender-based violence is mainstream within their services, so that they can actually find out if someone is being abused or someone is facing violence in their homes. So those systems, I think, is something that has to be integral part of it also. You mentioned that the church already has this structure. Actually, churches are not addressing this very much from the comments that I've read. So we really need to make this as part of our, as a ministry. You mentioned about, you know, the need for like physical, and also there are mental, they're also spiritual, because many women says, why am I questioning God? Why am I suffering? Why does this happen to me? So that comprehensiveness is also something that we need to address. Maybe Hanbit would like to add something from your own experience.
Thank you, Ronald. Can you repeat the question once again? Sorry.
The role of churches, how can we do, especially in terms of, you have already mentioned about the good experience that YWC and the churches do, but what do you feel?
So I have another like a good example that I can present to you. I think when we want to achieve the gender equality in the churches, I think the basic concept of the masculinity and femininity can also be changed, also need to be changed. So I want to suggest you to welcome more diverse interpretations of the Bible scriptures, welcoming especially the feminist theology in Asia, because which is one of the good legacy for Asian people. And also I want to suggest you to promote the diverse Bible studies regarding the new concept of the masculinity, especially for the boys in the churches. That is really important, because as I mentioned earlier, we cannot change the world by ourselves, like by women only, by one person only. We need our solidarity to change it together. To achieve that, we really need to change the basic mindset of the people. So I think in the churches, it will be really helpful for the people, for the younger generation, to be more gender equality people in Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very true. We need, I mean, the world needs more transformed or progressive men in order to address gender-based violence as well. And also, there was a comment in the previous section also about unlearning, because many of these things are something that we have learned culturally, and we also need to unlearn that, and we have to relearn. And that's why the biblical interpretation and the newer approach to those becomes very important. I saw a hand earlier from Subin from Nepal. Would you like to ask any question? We still have some 10 minutes, so we are good with few more questions, because this is a very important aspect of our consultation. So
I was wondering that since Korea has adopted different Korean SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So what's Korean SDGs are different from the normal, SDGs that the global have adopted, or is there any unique strategy that Korea has adopted to eliminate the violence against women? So would you like to highlight any points?
Actually, the index that I showed you earlier, that can be the unique one that we can approach. We approach it in our context, because as many of you already know it, the gender inequality reality are very different from the regions. So the European countries already achieved in some places of the gender equality, and they are now looking forward for the more diverse gender equality, not in the same context with us. So I think the contextualization and also the localization is very important for every strategies and every goals that we make in a kind of United Nations level, because it cannot be very fitting with our own context. So that is why the one of the indexes that I showed you, that is a well-designed the index only can, I think only can approach for the Korean society, because it knows that we have the division of men and women in many various places, and always men goes first. For example, in last month, I did the monitoring project with the government organization, and I saw so many images and pictures that men comes at the center, like men always men come first, or the women's or have to wear makeups or putting some accessories even in the pictures, even in the images, which is not the reality. And these are the also it can be reflected by the index that I showed you. That's why I can say that this is one of the unique approaches that we have it. Thank you.
We have 45 targets and 54 indicators in SDGs, actually, particularly looking at gender equality. So that could be a basis of something that we contextualize and use it in our own settings. So Ms. Ko, you were mentioning about the ICT. Could you like to explain that further?
Yes, so because there was a question about digital space and how it can be positive or negative for gender equality and gender-based violence. I mean, the pandemic has really increased the value of digital tools, and now countries are also increasingly working on digitalization strategies so that everybody is connected and so on. But we first need to be aware that there is a gender digital divide. In many countries, access to digital devices, there is a gender gap. And so, for example, if there is one smartphone in a household, control of the use of the smartphone is rarely in the hands of women in that household. And it wasn't just because this is a smartphone. With many different types of technologies, it's been the case. So, and it's just like a chicken and egg. And girls are growing up in this kind of societies thinking that technologies are not for them. So they don't go into studying science or technology, mathematics, engineering. This has also been a big problem, that there's a gender gap in STEM subject courses. More boys studying than girls. Then, more men will be finding jobs in digital sector like AI. And if you look at AI, AI absorbs knowledge given by humans, right? And then builds on them. So if they're given gender biased knowledge to start with, then that will be their foundation. I've seen chatbot. These kind of animated pictures of chatbot have a very either sexually suggestive or gender stereotypical figures, right? And again, I think if more diverse types of people engaged in IT sector, just like more diverse people engaged in deciding what COVID response measures should be, we could have more perspectives into designing AI. We worked with one AI robot some years ago, and it was a shape of a woman, and she had a makeup and a lipstick and hair was done. Like, who decided that the AI should look like that? Somebody decided that. Human hands is in there. So I think we do need to close the gender digital gap in many ways. One is, access to and ownership of devices and knowing how to use them. And this is why I was proposing maybe you can help, you can organize ICT classes for women and girls, so they feel more comfortable with using those devices. And then also, there was an example that we supported a hackathon program in Sri Lanka, and there were like provincial competitions, and then the final was to take place in a capital city. And when a call was sent out to young students to form teams to join this competition, mostly boys came. Actually, only boys came. So then we said, okay, please bring girls into your teams as well. And they were like, oh, but girls don't like these things. But then, we said, look harder. And then they found girls who were actually interested and able to compete in hackathon. But then their parents were saying, oh, but our daughters are not going to the big city, capital city, unaccompanied. So even if they won the provincial competition, they're not going to the final anyway. So what's the point of joining this competition? So there are different layers that are holding girls back from engaging in ICT or digital or IT sector. And we need to try to remove those barriers whenever we can. And I think in ICT classes, I thought maybe one good opportunity for churches to organize, and maybe some kind of competitions more related to technology and digital, and really ensuring that girls are equally participating in those, because it's, again, what Reid's saying, it's about challenging stereotypes, and as Ronald is saying, we need to unlearn what we had learned. We thought these things are only for boys. Now we have to unlearn that, and then bring girls into it to prove that, well, it's not just for boys.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. There is one comment from Reverend Valjakas from Taiwan about how to use that. Can you just explain that to us? You're muted, Reverend. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. When you at home to have a balance, you can use your hand like this. They will know you have a situation. You need to call help. Okay, like this.
Thank you. Yeah, those signals are very important, especially when you cannot communicate openly. So yes, that's a very good idea there. I think I will close. Oh, there is one more question. It is sad that social media, music, and arts justify gender inequality and even gender violence. What can we do as churches in this area?
I also agree with my Miui that we also need a safe space in online, that it can also include this gender inequality and also gender violence, because I don't know what, like exactly which music and which art occurs the inequality, gender inequality in your context, but I'm sure that we really need an online safe space, even online safe space. And also we need a cooperation with the social media companies. And also we need to make as a law and regulation for the government, then yeah, so we need a comprehensive effort to make the online safe space for all people. So I think that can be one of the answer that we can do.
From UNDP's experience, and this is a different faith, but we worked in Afghanistan with faith leaders. And what we did is we prepared a set of messages about gender equality that they can use as part of their Friday sessions. And so it was distributed to all of them, and they can pick and choose what might be more suitable. And we also then paired some of them with young men and women, mostly men, and then they would go around communities together to talk about gender equality with the community members, for faith leaders in Afghanistan. Because faith leaders are very powerful messengers and people listen to them.
Another answer I just remembered, the one women's group in Korea, which is called Umtuda. They are also trying to make a gender equality choir music, something like Christian music in their group. So it can be also be one of your project that you can promote. Thank you.
Innovations towards promoting gender equality. That is something that we need to highlight in order for our churches also to be involved, or our faith community to be involved in addressing this issue. Thank you very much to Ms. Khoi Mayoi and Rehanbit for this session. It was really engaging, and it was really, you've given us a lot of practical points that we can take home and use it in order to address gender equality within our own community, making it in our context.